Hey everyone, and welcome back to Somatox. Again, this is the space where we dive into the connection between body and mind from our everyday perspectives. As always, I'm your host, Agata Deras, and today we are talking about something that affects every single one of us every single day. It often happens without us realizing it. What is it? Dopamine. Some people call it the feel-good chemical, but that's only scratching the surface because dopamine is a much more profound topic to explore. It is at the heart of why we crave, why we scroll, why we binge. So the things that all of us do from time to time. In the end, dopamine levels can be responsible for our feeling of being stuck. In this episode, we will talk about what dopamine actually is, how it works in our brain, and why it can lead to addiction. But most importantly, how to regain control over our dopamine levels in the brain. We'll also use some insights from one of my favorite books that I read recently. It's called Dopamine Nation, written by Dr. Anna Lembke. If you are ready, let's start. Firstly, definition. What is dopamine? Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, so a chemical messenger in the brain. It helps neurons communicate. While it's often tied to pleasure, dopamine isn't really about the pleasure itself. It's about the anticipation of pleasure. It motivates us to seek rewards. Think of it as the brain's do it again signal, let's call it. It's the repetitive behavior of our brain. When you do something that feels good, whether it's eating chocolate, finishing a task, or checking your phone, dopamine is released. And it tells your brain that it feels good. So remember how to do that again. Dopamine plays also a crucial role in learning, movement, attention, mood, and habit formation. It's also why disorders like Parkinson's disease, which involve dopamine deficiencies, affect movement. So it's not just a pleasure chemical, but it's a fundamental driver of our behavior as human beings. Dopamine is often called the pleasure molecule, but again, more accurately, dopamine is about motivation and reward-seeking behavior. It doesn't really create pleasure, but it drives you to seek pleasure in your everyday activities. Apart from all the areas of life that I mentioned where dopamine plays a crucial role, as learning, motivation, attention, memory, movement, it is also responsible for mood regulation. Now let's answer the question how dopamine works in our brains. Actually, dopamine is produced in several areas of the brain, not only one. You should also know that dopamine spikes not just when you receive a reward, but also when you expect it. In experiments, animals showed more dopamine activity when a reward was anticipated than when it was actually received. So dopamine is the fuel behind motivation. It drives us to pursue our goals and pleasurable activities. Also, remember that each spike of dopamine reinforces the behavior that led to that reward. This is called reinforcement learning. Another interesting information could be taken from the Dopamine Nation book by Lembke, which I mentioned at the beginning. She explains that we are living in a time of overabundance. So we have a very easy access to dopamine-inducing activities, such as food, drugs, sex, social media, which are basically available all the time. This leads us to another important question about dopamine and addiction. Because dopamine is so powerful at shaping our behaviors, obviously it also plays a huge role in addictions. And addiction isn't just about substances like alcohol or drugs, but it's about any kind of behaviors like shopping, video games, scrolling, porn, binge watching, and so on. All of these trigger dopamine spikes. But the brain is really smart because when it senses a dopamine overload, it downregulates. It means that it decreases your dopamine receptors to protect itself. That means that you will now need more of the thing to feel the same effect. This is called dopamine tolerance. Eventually, the brain's baseline dopamine level drops. Things that used to bring you joy, like maybe going for a walk, seeing a friend, or reading a book, feel less pleasurable. You feel unmotivated and constantly searching for another hit. In Dopamination, again, Dr. Lembke describes this as the dopamine deficit state. It's a cycle of chasing pleasure and avoiding pain, but it actually leads to more pain. She says, we are living in a world of overabundance where anything we want is just a click away, and it's making us miserable. This is the quote that directly resonates with the previous one that I mentioned about the availability of all the pleasures that we have nowadays. Lembke's conclusions in the Dopamination are that we seek pleasure and we get addicted to this pleasure, but we feel only worse because our brain reduced dopamine receptors to protect from overstimulation. This leads to tolerance, so we need more for the same effect, and withdrawal, so we feel worse without it. Since we seek pleasure, we get addicted and we feel worse, we seek more pleasure. And this is how the vicious cycle starts. It leads to the question of the pain-pleasure balance. Lembke uses a very powerful metaphor in her book. She asks the reader to imagine a balancing seesaw with pleasure on one side and pain on the other one. Every time we lean too far into pleasure, the brain compensates by pushing back with pain. This is the pain-pleasure balance. That's why binging your favorite show might feel good in a moment, but it leaves you feeling sad afterward. That's the seesaw swinging the other side. After pleasure, there is time for pain. And the more we chase intense highs like sugar, social media, drugs, whatever, the harder the brain has to work to bring us back to balance. Over time, it gets harder to feel happy at all. This is why voluntary discomfort is so important. This is another notion from the book, like cold showers, fasting, exercise, meditation. All these things may feel hard in the moment, but they help reset the balance naturally. The key is to allow space for discomfort. Fasting from pleasure can restore balance. Lembke describes it, we've lost the ability to tolerate even minor discomforts. Our constant need to feel good is making us sick. Because the more we overstimulate, the harder the brain works to bring us back, leading to so-called anhedonia, inability to feel pleasure. Sustainable ways to boost dopamine include, for example, physical activity, completing some small tasks, listening to music, learning new things, connecting with people, being in nature, and so on. But then there are also those high stimulation activities that cause intense dopamine spikes, like junk food, porn, social media, drugs, alcohol, and so on. Quick boosters of dopamine cause higher spikes of dopamine, leading to faster crashes and risk of addiction. So there is a long-term cost of such quick pleasures. Then the question arises, how to regulate dopamine. One of the most powerful tools indicated in the book is dopamine fasting. So for example, Lembke suggests 30 days of abstaining from anything that you depend on in your sensations of pleasure. This might mean cutting out sugar, gaming, Instagram, and so on. For some people, it's much harder than they expect. But after the initial crash, your brain starts to reset. And I'm not talking just about addiction, it's the general rule that we all need to face. Dopamine levels starts to reset. you start to find joy in simple things again. Other tools for regulation might include daily exercise, practicing mindfulness, delayed gratification, and getting enough sleep. Pleasure comes more easily when you stop chasing it. So this dopamine fasting, or intentional abstinence, as Lembke also calls it, allows you to create the space between you and the pleasurable activity so that the pleasure is much higher. In order to reset the baseline levels of dopamine in your brain, apart from meditation, sleep, and all the other things that I mentioned, you can try mindfulness, social connection. On the other hand, what happens when we don't regulate our dopamine levels? When we don't do that, the consequences are quite real because we see rising rates of anxiety, depression, sometimes burnout, or even addiction. It's especially true among young people because constant stimulation that they are facing nowadays rewires our brains to expect dopamine all the time without any pause. And when we don't get it, we simply crash. But the good news is that the brain has a lot of neuroplasticity. It means that it is quite flexible and we can rewire it again. So you can change the functioning of your brain. And this starts always with awareness. Again, to quote Lembke, she says, "We are medicating discomfort instead of tolerating it." Before we sum up, I'd like to share with you some fun facts regarding dopamine. Firstly, what I already said before, dopamine is more about anticipation. You feel more excitement before receiving the pleasure than during actually feeling pleasure. Another fun fact is about the strength of our brain's bond with dopamine. For example, in some laboratory studies, rats would press a lever thousands of times for a dopamine hit until they collapse from exhaustion. This also shows how dopamine can be dangerous to our brain because it's really difficult to stop and to find balance with it. Dopamine is also released when we help other people, so every act of kindness is chemically rewarding. Next fun fact is that even uncertainty may trigger dopamine, although it's not a pleasurable experience. But this is why, for example, social media is so addictive because we never know what we will find there, we never know how people will react to our pictures, and so on and so on. The last fun fact is that dopamine doesn't just make us feel good, but it makes us pursue anything at all, basically. So it's also the tool for our motivation and action. To sum up with final thoughts, what do we do with all this information in the end? First, don't think of dopamine as something bad. It's not the enemy, but it's a part of our biology. It helps us pursue goals and basically stay alive. But in our modern world, we've broken this system. We've overdosed dopamine many times, and now we have to detox a little bit. So I suggest you to take time to reset. Allow yourself to maybe feel bored sometimes. Try to feel and accept this discomfort of not receiving the pleasure that you want. Maybe you could try to rediscover joy in very small, quiet moments, like going for a walk, going to forest, being in nature, and so on. You just may be overstimulated, and this is why you are interested in the topic of dopamine, because you actually need to balance it back. And recovery from this overstimulation is always possible because your brain and your body are always on your side, and if you treat them well, you will find the balance again. Your mind and body are deeply interconnected, as we prove it in every episode of Somatox. And when you respect your body, when you respect your mind, and you take into account the effect of dopamine on both of them, you can reclaim your joy, your motivation, your satisfaction, and most importantly, your inner peace. If this episode resonated with you, I highly recommend checking out the book that I mentioned, Dopamine Nation by Dr. Anna Lembke. It's a very eye-opening and honestly life-changing book. Don't forget to follow Soma Talks for more mind-body explorations. Thanks for listening today to Soma Talks. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with your friend, with your family. Leave some comment or a review and let me know how you feel about your journey with Soma Talks. Stay present, stay curious, and keep reconnecting your body and mind, because this is what Soma Talks is about. Until next time, Soma Talks, Agata Daras.